Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā minui, kia koutou, ko Derek Wenmoth tōku ingoa. It's a great pleasure to be part of this session today. I've looked at the Leaders Connect sessions, and in the past I've always sort of been at an inconvenient time for the work that I do, but tonight Carolyn's forced me to make sure that that's not the case. What I'd like to do tonight with you really is to pose some thoughts and to have you involved. So rather than spend a long time on a presentation, because a lot of the ideas that I'm going to share, I'm sure you've engaged with to some degree or another. So I want to get straight to a provocation. And the provocation really stems around this thing that challenges us. It doesn't matter whether we're in primary, secondary, or whatever, but the whole idea of our education system, or as Neil Postman talks about, what is the end of education? And a systematic review of documentation around the world would suggest that the vast majority of countries, including New Zealand, would see the end of education being tied up with the world of work, that we're developing citizens of the future who will become productive economic units somewhere in there. And if you think about the language and the programs that we use, that world of work seems to be at the center of a lot of it. Now, I'm not suggesting that I wholeheartedly agree with that, but that's possibly the first provocation, is that the question about to what extent does our vision or view of the world of work kind of dictate or determine the view or vision that we have of the purpose of the school, and therefore the purpose that we have as teachers. Now, there's been a lot of studies about the world of work as it applies to education, and we've seen things like we've got here. So this is a not unfamiliar kind of list that has come from the World Economic Forum in this case, where it's listing the skills that we need for a future workforce. I had a guy text me this morning a little meme that said, thank goodness they taught me all about quadratic equations and maths at high school instead of filling out a tax return, because it becomes really, really useful in quadratic equation season. And of course, it was this tongue-in-cheek way of thinking about what's the relevance, the deep and connected relevance between what we are teaching in school and what we're producing in terms of our students and their lives forward. And when you look at a list like the one that you've got on the wall here or on your screen, there's a whole lot of things there that certainly weren't at the foreground of people's thinking when I was at school, but more and more and more are the things that shaped, informed teachers as they're presenting. It doesn't matter what curriculum area or what level of the school, but understanding some of these things becomes really important. The big challenge for us, though, is that I guess in New Zealand, we can claim that we've had a competency-based curriculum for 18 years now. We've had a curriculum that has in it, for instance, a key principle is being future-focused. Where we think about all of those dimensions of being future focused, like being entrepreneurial and so forth, being innovative in our outlook and so on. The challenge is, to what extent really have we grasped hold of this? What is driving us? What's the burning platform, if you like, that is causing us to alter the way that we think about education for the future as well as in the future? There was a report came out last week I just want to refer to in this, that was one of the first that I've seen, a global report, 52 countries, and it was looking at the extent to which these countries are making progress towards developing key competencies in their young people. So this global team have identified 12 competencies, and they had the 52 countries use data they have to report back to them how things are going in those countries. And I'm not going to unpack it all because there's a lot of questions that it raises. But at a surface level, it's interesting to note this, that across the board, these 12 measures, New Zealand appears, fairly well up the rankings, sort of at the bottom of the top third, if you like. And you can see that we're, each side of us, Austria, Luxembourg, above us, so we've got the USA sitting there, UK, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland. These countries are always appearing near the top of all the OECD scales. And any of you who have come across the work of Charles Fidel, he's well worth looking up. He's the guy who's heading this up. You'll see his name over there, Charles Fidel, F-A-D-E-L. And you'll get a link to this show at the end. There's a link at the bottom to the report as well for you. Now, the interesting thing is when you start unpacking the 12 competencies, that, as I say, New Zealand, one of the few countries in the world that's had a curriculum that has identified the development of these competencies for a future-focused outcome for about 18 years. It's not surprising then that in many of them we do remarkably well, and we are sort of up this in the top quarter for most of them. But here's the interesting thing, and it's something that got me really thinking. There were 2 out of the 12 where we were right down the other end. And I guess if I got you to guess, you might or might not guess. I'm going to go straight to it. The first of those was actually critical thinking. And, you know, we sit down there with Thailand and Luxembourg and countries down the end. And you really need to engage with the report, perhaps to understand a whole lot more, as I say, about the measure. So I'm not promoting this as the most definitive measure, but it is the most definitive measure that we've had so far as this data is starting to come together. And the question it raises for me is, at a point in our history where we've had this focus on competencies, where we've been thinking for some time about what it really means to set young people on a trajectory into the future where they'll thrive and flourish, how is it that something that's so important as critical thinking has ranked so lowly for us? And you start to think about a whole lot of issues that we've got. For instance, it was on our own news last night, the issue around how easily sucked in we are to fake news and to being you know, caught up in advertising that leads us astray and so forth. And the lack of ability to think critically or to even engage critically in conversation is something that I would think is an extremely high priority. The other one, which is a huge surprise to me, was this one. Just straight communication, the ability to give clear articulation and expression of the ideas that we have, and to convey meaning, to persuade, to do all these other sorts of things that are part of communication. So whilst we rank really high, this particular survey ranks us low on those 2 really, really essential areas for the future: critical thinking and communication. Now, not wanting to dwell on those things in particular, I want to use that as part of the provocation as we think about what are the signals that we as educators should be taking notice of. What are the things that are happening around us all the time that if we've got time to have our radar up, we are taking notice of? And so I use that report with the critical thinking communication. There's a bit of a signal there on the first hand to exercise our own critical judgment and start getting into saying, how valid is that data? What is the rationale for why we appear there? But if there is some truth in that, then what are the implications for our teaching and our expectations of young people to prepare them for that future world? And I've got this, the book that I've quoted there, Amy Webb. If you haven't read any of her stuff, she's written this fabulous one called The Signals Are Talking, where I got this title. She's a well-renowned global futurist, and in that book she gives some really good frameworks for how we ought to be thinking about the future. And at the heart of it is this idea that we are immersed in and surrounded by signals, as she calls them, the things that on their own don't necessarily make sense, but as we spend time reflecting on them over time, we start to see the patterns. Then those patterns become a trend, and those trends give us an idea of a trajectory that we need to be taking some meaning and understanding of. Think about this. About, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, I remember talking at conferences about and using plastic as a centerpiece for getting us to think long term about what we are doing to our planet through the unquestioning and uncritical use of plastic, which is a material that we derive from extracting the raw material out of our planet, out of the earth, It's got a limited amount of stuff that we can use to make plastic, but then at the other end of its life, it goes back into the environment in a form that lasts for tens of thousands of years and has become part of our food cycle and so forth. And you'll see on the side there just a little comment from The Guardian that says, travel back to even 2015, all the things that we knew about plastic were already known, but people really weren't angry about it. Something happened which created a tipping point moment. And if we think about the announcement just in the last couple of weeks, or in the last week, by the current government, that New Zealand's going to ban the raft of single-use plastics by 2025, we're going to see some anger on both sides. There's anger that's generated the idea of saying, hey, we need to do something about this, but there's going to be anger by a whole lot of people who haven't been reading the signals, who don't yet buy into the idea. And there's a critical piece here that I feature in the talk here, is understanding how it is that we need to think long about what we're doing. And that's pretty hard for us, particularly people in my age group, post-war generation, grew up, baby boomers, everything was at our feet, it all came easy. And boy, oh boy, we want it now and we just want it right in our doorstep. And we had expectations of becoming personally successful, wealthy, all those sorts of things, own our own home, our own car, looked after for life and retirement, that sort of thing. It's very counter to a lot of cultures have done over time. A lot of decisions, if you think about the anthropological studies into cultures globally, including our own Maori culture, a lot of decisions are made with what they call 7-generation thinking. They're thinking into the long term. If we were thinking about that, about our use of plastics, we'd ban them tomorrow. There's no way we'd have that. And so those signals have been building and building and building to the point where we've now got a critical mass of people who have read the signals, the patterns are formed, the trend is before us, and people like me are starting to think about my grandkids who may really struggle to find food that doesn't have high quantities of plastic in it, where the plastic's not affecting their own metabolism, lifestyle, just to pick one thing. Another one is this whole idea of fuel of the future. Back in 2003, George W. Bush made this big prediction and people laughed at it. The idea of hydrogen. Who wants to walk around or drive around with a highly explosive tank of hydrogen gas in the back and so forth? And yet, since 2003, it's not just about hydrogen, it's about battery cars. And again, the same thing happened at conferences where I was speaking about the future and just highlighting, not in a predictive way, but as the signals were signaling that petrol was going to skyrocket, our ability to make ourselves reliant on fossil fuels and on oil and carbon fuels and things, we needed to look beyond that. And so we see just in the last week or so, even more emphasis on hydrogen. We've had 2 car companies globally who have released hydrogen cars into the market. And it's, about where we were about 6-7 years ago with battery cars. Now, I would suggest to you that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of our signals. The signals are that we're looking for an alternative to the extractive fuels we've had. But if we really read the signals are signaling to us that why are we worrying about cars? They're causing the questions, at least, that we should ask us. Why are we worrying about cars? What is it that causes this reliance on everyone owning their own vehicle for getting around? What alternatives might there be for that? Now, I'm only just using those as examples of things that have been happening right under our nose over the last decade or so, where the signals have been there for a long time, but all of a sudden we've reached that tipping point. And I'm suggesting to you that we've reached that tipping point in education. The recent COVID experience has brought to the surface a whole lot of things about our education system, both good things and not so good things that we need to be thinking about. And so, question I want you to go and think about in some groups for a moment is to think about what are some of those signals that you see. And in the little bubble on the right there, you'll see that I've mentioned some of the things that are mentioned to me almost inevitably when I am working in schools or with groups of teachers, right? And if instead of seeing these as the things that are driving us, wearing us down or whatever, what happens if we look at some of those things as signals? What are they signaling to us, particularly when we look at all of them together? You take the example of inequity alongside something like student boredom or disengagement, and then against exam stress, about teacher stress, about over-assessment. You start to build up a picture that gets us questioning the very basis of the structure and the organisation of our schools. Post-COVID, you could add to that a whole lot of other things, like the delight that many people found in an online learning environment of being able to work at their own place, their own time, their own place, where they hadn't been able to do that before. Now, we know that that doesn't apply to everyone, so I'm not trying to say this is a simple, easy binary decision, but you look at the signals around the sheer numbers of young people who are accessing online education sites such as Khan Academy, or who are enrolled in things like the Education Perfect and various mathletics and all these other sorts of things, which are starting to illustrate to us that in fact there is meaningful engagement that some are finding contributes to their learning outside of the straight teacher in a classroom thing. So the big question I'm going to get you to think about in a moment is, so what are some of these signals we ought to be taking about? And bearing in mind here, a little quote that I've just put in there. Last night I was sitting on a conference call with a small group of people, including Charles Fidel, who are looking at the whole idea globally of what might be the next generation of thinking about assessment. What are the signals we need to be taking notice of there? And there was a woman on there from the London School of Economics who made the comment that she and her colleagues had just done a huge study of 22 major country reports on the future of education, an analysis of what was happening and pulling it all together. And she made this comment. She said, you know, across all 22 on the analysis, she said, there's a strong consensus on what needs to be done, but so far, very few people are doing it. And so here's what I want you to do in a moment. We're going to put you into some groups, and I've created this Jamboard, all right? And I'm just going to go out of my direct share and share instead my actual Jamboard screen, so you can see what it looks like and how to use it. So you've got we'll put into the chat the little link that will take you here. First thing, just click up in here and you can type in the names of the people in your group. It may be that there's only about 3 of you in a group, I think, Stephen, to rock it up here. And then I want you to focus on these first 2 columns here. And then we're going to take a chance to come back and talk about it. Here's where I want you to think about, what are some of the signals that we see? What are some of the things that are important for us to be focusing on as a result of those signals? And so this is just a sort of a random thing. To put a new sticky there, there's on the side, you just double click on that. Oops, don't have to double click. You click on that. You can type away in the sticky. You can choose the color. I've color coded these. So there's orange, and go save. And it just appears there, and you can just drag it down into your area, right? And do that for as many as you like and as much as you like. And we'll come back in about, what did we say there? We're going to give you at 12 minutes anyway, about, yeah, not too far away, maybe a little less. We'll give you a signal when you've put a few stickies in there. We'll come back, we'll share what we've got and make it happen. Now, one thing to take notice of, you'll be put into a group in a minute. Take notice of the number of the group, and then at the top here, just navigate your way through to the group number that you've been put in. Okay, so there's just a repetition of the same thing here. We don't want you all working on the same Jamboard, all right? Okay, so what I'd like you to do now, as we just wind this thing together, on this side of the Jamboard, and I see your group's already put one thing in there, I want you to spend just 5 minutes back in those groups then, and this is where you're allowed to look at all the other Jamboards and you're allowed to steal ideas or be prompted by them. But in the short time, think about just that 1 or 2 or 3 things even that you think that could be done to address this, and thinking this is the short term. What if you had the chance to come back into your school context and have responsibility to do something between now and the end of the year? What might it be? What could be a change thing? And maybe another thing that's over the next couple of years, and maybe something that's a bit longer. Be quite specific, but use the ideas to drag it through and see if we can post some things here. So what we've done in a very abbreviated time, but you've identified some things there that are all achievable for yourselves as leaders in the school, whatever that means in the roles and responsibilities that you have. And I think if there was an encouragement I'd make, it's to understand that, yeah, it might feel like there's a hell of a lot of pressure coming from outside, and someone's mentioned initiative overload. But the reality is we do still live in a climate where it is possible to just take the foot off, to say no to some things and start doing some things well. That takes a little bit of leadership courage. It takes a commitment to a vision that you're all galvanized around. But at the end of the day, it'll do the things we're talking about. It'll release the passion in people. You stick with it. You don't come in halfway through and say, oh, I'm going to change now because this has come. And you actually see a change for your kids, and you bring your community in with you, as would be my thing. So look, I want to just finish with one more slide here that makes two bold statements that I want to leave with you. And as I say, you can get these slides at the end and download it anyway. But the first one is this: our education system is too narrow and doesn't give people the skills they need for work and life. All right. Now, the questions I've just put under there that might be something that you could use in your own context from today is, in red under that, just simply having the conversation. Do you agree? What evidence do you have for the opinion you've got, whether you agree, disagree? So what are the skills they're going to need? And then should we only be thinking of skills, which gets us into thinking about competencies, dispositions, capabilities? Is there a difference between those words? Right? So just to give you something that would perhaps, as leaders, start you down the track of planning, as Robin's group talked about the powerful PLD, there's a provocation. And the second one I'll leave you with is this one: a knowledge-rich curriculum with a narrow focus on traditional subjects and a tired system of assessment can only get us so far. We must change the what and how we teach our children. All right? Now, again, the same thing. What are the changes we need to make in the what and the how? And some of you identified those in the little exercise we've just done. Brings you back to the barriers and opportunities, and what are the consequences of not changing. That last question is one I use a lot in the work that I do with schools, because, and particularly with parent groups, everyone starts arguing when the pressure's on. Everyone begins to start arguing for the status quo, because that's what we know and that's what we're inclined to feel will make us comfortable. But we have to be challenged with saying, so what's the consequence of not changing? Is there a burning platform here? As Amanda said, if that child psychologist is right, and there's going to be so much work in the future that is the domain of AI, are we comfortable with that? What should we be preparing ourselves and our kids for to respond to that? Okay, so there's my thought to leave you with. I'm going to hand back now to Carolyn, but just as I do, there's some links at the bottom there to my FutureMakers website. And my blog. Actually, you can use the FutureMakers. There's a link off the top of the FutureMakers website. I'd suggest you go there. All these links are going to be sent to you at the end. But if you really are interested, you can subscribe to the FutureMakers website, and I send out regular newsletters with updates that link to a lot of these reports and some of the things that are happening nationally and internationally, and so that can add fuel to the fire for you if you're happy for someone else to curate the good ideas that are around the place. And a lot of those things, if you go to my blog from the link on that webpage, I blog about, and so I add some commentary. So one of the recent ones, for instance, is a blog post about that Charles Fidel report that I use the graphs from. So if that's helpful to you to keep up to date with some of that thinking and then inject it into the conversations you have, then it's my pleasure to share it with you.